Hi, Hume 115 students. It's your favorite professor and critical thinker, Professor Trent. I am here with your Chapter 13 lecture summary. If you've got your PDF of your textbook pulled up, we are on page 468. If you have your printed copy, go ahead and get out your binder and let's look at it together. All right, page 468, review of major points for Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is all about inductive arguments. Now, you remember inductive arguments from earlier in the semester. These are arguments whose premises do not guarantee their conclusion. So let me say that another way. An inductive argument is when you make a claim where the conclusion is possible, plausible, or likely, but not definitive. All right, if it were a definitive claim, it would have to be deductive. Inductive means that you are building a case, an argument, such that the conclusion is likely to be possible based on the evidence you have presented. So join me on page 468 and we'll dig into this a little bit deeper. So inductive arguments are more common than deductive arguments. This makes sense, right? Because very few things are guaranteed. Very few things can be deduced without any wiggle room of possibility or plausibility. Therefore, the majority of the arguments that you hear at the dinner table, that you read on social media, that you see on TV are inductive arguments. The arguer is offering premises that likely or possibly lead to the conclusion or claim. Now, there are many different types of inductive arguments, so we're going to talk about those in just a minute, but let's finish up the review of major points. So remember that inductive arguments are a little bit different from deductive arguments in that inductive arguments are strong and cogent, but they run a gamut or a spectrum of being strong and weak. What that means, simply put, is that some premises might be stronger than others. And so when someone's offering you an inductive argument, you will evaluate their premises, their evidence, based on what you think whether you think it is strong or weak or somewhere in between. Now, there's lots of different ways to assess for strength and weakness. And when we get into the patterns of inductive reasoning, this will make more sense. For instance, if you're looking at an inductive generalization, one way to test as to whether that inductive piece of evidence is strong or weak is to look at the sample size of a given population, or the statistics, or the reporting, or how the data was collected, or what does the sample population look like? Is it representative of the entire population? So these are things to think about as you are evaluating for inductive strength, because remember, inductive arguments do not guarantee their conclusions. Rather, they offer evidence in which their conclusions or claims are likely, possible, or plausible given the evidence. All right, so let's look at your glossary. I'm on page 468, and there's a few words that I'm going to highlight for you. You'll see these on your upcoming quizzes and your final exam. Be sure to review what a sampling method looks like and what it is, what generalizations are, so biased sampling methods and biased generalizations. Obviously, if we are crafting an inductive argument, we want to avoid bias if at all possible. So we're looking for sampling methods and generalizations that are strong and cogent, which means that they are not biased. All right, so following over on 469, fallacies. So fallacies weaken inductive arguments. Fallacies are flaws in reasoning. You remember these from chapter 8. Then head on down to inductive generalization. Put a star by inductive generalization. An inductive generalization is one of the more common forms of inductive argument patterns. It is when you generalize or make a claim based on a sample. It's also called inductive by enumeration, but more likely you're going to see it as inductive generalization. So an example of an inductive generalization is when academics and scholars of critical thinking, of mass media, make generalizations about social media behaviors of Generation Z or younger millennials or older millennials like me, based on sample sets from that population. So an inductive generalization about a particular generation has to have a diverse enough sample set in order to be representative of that particular generation. So that would be an example of inductive generalization. It's easy, as you can see, to start getting into fallacies because your reasoning has to be spot on. It's easy to make a flaw in reasoning when you are crafting inductive generalizations. So your job as a critical thinker is to review the evidence, look at the data, look at the sample set, look at the sample method, look at the population, look at the generalization, and really pick apart to see if you feel like it is a strong, cogent, inductive argument, in that the evidence likely leads to the conclusion. All right, let's look at some more vocab words. Population is the sample set or group whose characteristics are the focus of the inductive generalization or the inductive argument. We just gave the example of generation population. So if you wanted to study social media habits of Gen Z, you would pick a population set based on Gen Z, but it would have to be a diverse enough population sample set in order for the inductive argument to be strong. All right, so random sampling method, these are all ways in which academics, scholars, critical thinkers collect evidence based on samples from populations. All right, let's see, statistic. So statistics, when you see statistics as an inductive argument, you will often see data, all right? So numbers, percentages, measurements pulled from a particular sample set. That is going to be a statistical inductive argument. Now, let's head back over to the first of chapter 13. I should have marked my page numbers. But while I'm doing this, let me tell you, 431. I love inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is really fun because it allows you, the critical thinker, to really flex the muscles that you've built this semester. Because if you think about it, a deductive argument guarantees its claim or its conclusion. An inductive argument does not. That means that the critical thinker has to use all the tools in their toolbox to determine if the inductive argument is strong and cogent. So let's look at some of the patterns of inductive reasoning. All right, page 431 is your start of inductive reasoning. Inductive generalization, we talked about that. When you make a generalization based on a sample population, but you must have a representative sample that is representative of that entire population. You could read more about how scholars, critical thinkers, academics get a representative sample, researchers, on page 436 and beyond. So another common inductive argument pattern is an analogy when you compare two things. Now, obviously, if you compare two things that are comparable, you have a poor analogy. So you want to be careful when you're making an inductive argument that compares two things, that you compare apples to apples, as the saying goes, and not apples to oranges. Another type of inductive argument is appeal to authority. I'm on page 449. Or argument from authority, I'm sorry, sometimes called an appeal to authority. But an argument from authority or an appeal to authority is when you craft an argument based on an expertise of a particular person or group. So in inductive arguments, if you're reading the news, you're reading a newspaper article, you will often see that journalists may go to a particular expert within a field and get the expert's view on that particular claim. And that is called an argument from authority. In other words, the journalist or reporter is seeking the expertise of that expert, that researcher, that scholar, that teacher, that professional, whomever, in order to provide evidence, often anecdotal, that that claim is plausible, possible, and likely. Argument from analogy. This is another pattern on page 451. Argument from analogy is when you compare two things. Now remember, again, you've got to compare two things that are comparable. So thus far, we've talked about three patterns: inductive generalization, argument from authority, and inductive analogy. Different textbooks use different terminology, and so I'm being very careful with my terminology because your textbook terminology is different from previous textbooks that we've used. So if I'm getting my terminology mixed up, that's why. Inductive generalization, argument from authority, and then argument from analogy. Causal inference, often called causal pattern, is 4, 5, 9. Causal inference is when you have an inductive argument that is like cause and effect. Evidence is presented to make the case that this is going to cause this, or this is going to be predictive of this, or this caused this. An example of an inductive argument using causal inference would be climate change. Evidence is presented in which this is going to lead to this, or this has led to this. So causal inference is a common inductive pattern. Now we talked about testing an argument's strength. So go back and pay close attention to page 460 and beyond. You're using all of the tools in your toolbox that you have learned thus far, including evaluating for, are the premises solid? Does the evidence make sense? Of course, you're going to allow for the principle of charity, but you're also going to think about the burden of proof. Has the person presenting the inductive argument indeed provided enough evidence, sufficient evidence, for you to accept the claim as strong and cogent? Do they have anecdotes? Do they have an inductive generalization? Do they have an argument from authority? Do they have an argument from an analogy? Have they provided statistics and probability, like page 465? Is there data? This is going to tell you ultimately whether the person is presenting a strong, cogent argument. Now, again, different from deductive arguments, because deductive arguments guarantee their conclusion. Inductive arguments mean that the evidence, the premises presented, leads to a conclusion that is plausible, likely, or possible. The majority of arguments you encounter every day are inductive. Therefore, it really makes your brain what I call crunch, in that you've really got to think about it and evaluate the evidence to determine if you think it's sufficient evidence and that it's strong and cogent enough to accept the claim. Inductive arguments are my favorite kind of arguments. They're really fun. They're like puzzle pieces, and there's no sort of black and white answer to inductive arguments because, again, they are tested on a spectrum of strength and weakness. So the next time you're watching the news, you're scrolling through social media, start looking for inductive arguments. Start looking for claims that are possible or plausible or likely, and then go the extra mile of assessing the evidence presented. See if you can spot patterns, and if you find something in the news that you see that you think is interesting, post it below in the comments and we can all look at it together. I'm Professor Trent. This has been your lecture summary on Chapter 13, Inductive Reasoning. Thanks for watching.